Hey friend, welcome to Sleepy History Universe. Before we begin tonight's journey, if this channel becomes a place you enjoy returning to, a place where slow storytelling helps you unwind, relax, and drift peacefully towards sleep, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps this little corner of history continue to grow, bringing you more calm evenings filled with fascinating stories from the past. Now, settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you can, and let the noise of the modern world slowly fade away. Tonight, we're opening the front door to Victorian London, not to explore its famous landmarks or crowded streets, but to uncover the hidden life inside its homes. Imagine standing on a quiet London street in the 1850s. Rows of elegant brick houses stretch into the distance, their polished brass knockers gleaming beneath the soft glow of gas lamps. To every passerby, they appear calm, respectable, and perfectly ordinary. But behind those neatly drawn curtains lies a world almost no outsider ever sees. Tonight, you'll step beyond the front door and discover what really happened inside these homes. From servants waking before dawn to light the fires, to wealthy families gathering for candlelit dinners, hidden staircases used only by maids, secret routines that kept every room spotless, and quiet moments that history books rarely mention. As the city outside buzzed with industry and progress, another world unfolded behind these walls, one built on routine, invisible labour, family traditions, and countless untold stories. So, take a slow breath, get comfortable, and together, let's quietly step inside a London house in the 1850s, where every room holds a secret, every staircase tells a story, and an ordinary day reveals an extraordinary hidden world. Imagine stepping through the polished front door of a respectable London house in the 1850s, where the brass knocker gleams, the windows sparkle with careful attention, and the neat brick exterior quietly promises comfort, order, and prosperity. From the street, everything appears calm and proper, exactly as Victorian society expected it to be. Neighbours pass without seeing much more than tidy curtains, and perhaps a servant sweeping the front steps. Yet behind those walls exists an entire hidden world, one filled with routines, unspoken rules, invisible labour, whispered conversations, and countless small details that reveal how people truly lived. A Victorian house was never simply a place to sleep. It was a carefully organised machine that reflected status, discipline, wealth, and family reputation. Every room had a purpose, every object conveyed a message, and every person inside understood where they belonged. To visitors, the house displayed elegance and respectability. To those who lived within it, however, daily life was often far more complicated than appearances suggested. Your morning begins long before the family stirs. If you are the lady of the house, you rarely hear the first sounds of activity because servants have already been awake for hours. While darkness still hangs over London, the maid quietly opens shutters, sweeps ashes from yesterday's fires, polishes grates, and carries fresh coal from the cellar. Another servant hauls buckets of water from pumps, because indoor plumbing is still uncommon in many homes. Heavy copper kettles are filled and placed over kitchen ranges that require constant attention to maintain heat. The cook has already begun preparing breakfast, while the smell of burning coal slowly drifts upward through the house. None of this work is meant to be seen. In the Victorian ideal, servants should appear almost invisible, ensuring that comfort seems effortless. As sunlight filters through lace curtains, the family bedrooms gradually awaken. Bedrooms are surprisingly cold for much of the year because fires are expensive to maintain in every room. Thick curtains help keep warmth inside, but frost sometimes forms on windows during harsh winters. Large feather mattresses provide comfort, yet rising from beneath heavy blankets into chilly air is never pleasant. Beside the bed sits a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher. Before breakfast, you wash using water carried upstairs by servants. Hot water is a luxury carefully distributed according to priority, and many people make do with only warm or even cold water depending on the household's finances. The bedroom itself tells a quiet story about the family. Dark wooden wardrobes, embroidered cushions, polished mirrors, framed family portraits, and carefully folded clothing all demonstrate respectability. Every object has been cleaned and arranged because disorder reflects badly upon the household. Even children's rooms are expected to appear disciplined. Toys are neatly stored away, books are stacked properly, and clothing is folded with remarkable precision. Victorian homes value order almost as highly as honesty. Downstairs, breakfast unfolds according to strict routines. Wealthier families enjoy eggs, bacon, fresh bread, preserves, tea, fish, kidneys, porridge, and seasonal fruit when available. Silver cutlery shines brilliantly because servants spend countless hours polishing every piece. Conversation remains polite rather than lively. Newspapers often occupy much of the father's attention as reports arrive covering Parliament, colonial affairs, railway expansion, crime, and foreign events. Mothers oversee children with quiet authority, ensuring proper manners are observed. A careless posture, loud laughter, or speaking out of turn receives immediate correction. Good behavior is not optional. It is considered essential preparation for adulthood. After breakfast, each family member disappears into separate worlds. Victorian houses encourage privacy more than earlier generations. The father may leave for business in the City of London, travelling by horse, drawn carriage or omnibus through increasingly crowded streets filled with merchants, factory workers, chimney sweeps, flower sellers, and newspaper boys shouting headlines. His absence leaves the house under the management of his wife, whose responsibilities are far greater than many imagine. Although wealthy women often have servants, they rarely spend their days doing nothing. Instead, they supervise nearly every aspect of household management. Menus must be planned, accounts reviewed, deliveries checked, linens inspected, servants instructed, invitations answered, charities supported, clothing repaired, and social visits arranged. Maintaining a respectable home requires constant organisation. A single mistake, whether an overcooked dinner or dusty drawing room, risks damaging the family's reputation among friends and relatives. The servants themselves live an entirely different existence beneath the same roof. Their bedrooms are usually small attic rooms with narrow beds, simple furniture, and little decoration. They eat separately from the family, using plain dishes rather than fine china. Their schedules are exhausting. A housemaid may climb dozens of flights of stairs every day carrying coal, water, linens, and chamber pots. Her hands become rough from endless scrubbing. The cook works beside roaring kitchen ranges that fill the air with heat, steam, and smoke. Laundry day is especially demanding. Heavy sheets are soaked, scrubbed by hand, boiled in enormous tubs, wrung dry with aching arms, and hung wherever space permits. The physical effort required would surprise many modern observers accustomed to washing machines and electric dryers. The kitchen serves as the true heart of hidden household life. Visitors rarely enter this busy space. Here copper pots hang neatly from hooks, while bread rises beneath cloths and soups. Simmer slowly over coal fires. Every meal demands hours of preparation because there are no electric mixers, refrigerators, or microwave ovens. Fresh meat must be purchased frequently. Before spoilage begins, vegetables require careful cleaning. Bread is often baked daily. Ice exists only for the wealthiest households with special storage arrangements. Food preservation depends upon salting, pickling, drying, and cool pantries, rather than modern refrigeration. Throughout the afternoon, another side of Victorian life unfolds in drawing rooms and parlours. These elegant spaces represent the public face of the home. Guests are welcomed with tea poured from polished silver pots, accompanied by cakes, sandwiches, and careful conversation. The furniture is arranged to encourage polite discussion rather than relaxation. Piano music fills the room as daughters demonstrate accomplishments expected of educated young ladies. Needlework rests neatly beside embroidered cushions, suggesting quiet industry even during leisure. Yet beneath these pleasant conversations often lie concerns about finances, marriage prospects, illnesses, inheritance, and social competition that remain politely unspoken. Children experience the house very differently from adults. In wealthy families, they spend much of their day in nurseries, under the supervision of nurses or governesses. Lessons include reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, French, music, drawing, and religious instruction. Discipline is firm, and childhood is viewed less as carefree play than as preparation for responsible adulthood. Boys are encouraged toward leadership, while girls learn accomplishments considered suitable for future wives and mothers. Despite these expectations, children still invent games, build imaginary worlds, chase one another through gardens, and secretly laugh when adults are not watching. Hidden behind polished hallways are countless practical details visitors rarely notice. Coal dust settles almost everywhere. Despite constant cleaning, candles leave wax drippings that must be scraped away. Oil lamps require trimming and refilling. Fires need continual attention or rooms quickly grow cold. Chimneys accumulate soot that chimney sweeps periodically remove under dangerous conditions. Mice occasionally appear in pantries despite every effort to prevent them. Rain leaks through aging roofs. Wallpaper peels in damp corners. Maintaining a Victorian house is a never-ending battle against dirt, smoke, moisture, and decay. Even the smell of the house tells its own story. Coal smoke drifts gently through nearly every room. Beeswax polish gives furniture a warm scent. Fresh bread, roasting meat, soap, lavender sachets, damp wool coats, leather boots, extinguished candles, and burning fireplaces combine into an aroma unlike any modern home. During London's infamous fogs, smoke from thousands of chimneys mingles with mist outside, creeping indoors whenever doors are opened. Curtains, carpets, and clothing quietly absorb these scents until they become part of everyday life. Privacy exists, but not in the modern sense. Family members frequently overhear conversations through thin walls and connecting doors. Servants witness arguments they pretend not to hear. Letters are treasured because they carry personal thoughts across great distances, yet they are carefully locked away in desks once read. Diaries become trusted companions for private reflection, recording hopes and disappointments that cannot easily be shared aloud. Within these pages, respectable appearances sometimes give way to loneliness, frustration, grief, or quiet dreams of a different future. As evening approaches, lamps gradually replace daylight. Lighting remains expensive, encouraging families to gather together instead of occupying separate rooms. The drawing room comes alive once more. Someone plays the piano, while others read novels, newspapers, or volumes of poetry. As the seasons changed, the rhythm of the house changed with them. Winter demanded an extraordinary amount of preparation. Long before the coldest months arrived, deliveries of coal were carefully arranged and stacked in dark cellars beneath the house. A prosperous family might burn several tons of coal each year simply to keep fireplaces glowing in the principal rooms. Every bucket carried upstairs represented another journey down steep stone steps by a servant whose work remained almost entirely unnoticed. The coal itself left black dust on hands, aprons, and floors, meaning that constant sweeping was simply part of everyday life. Curtains were drawn before sunset to trap whatever warmth remained. Thick rugs covered wooden floors, and family members gathered close to fireplaces because heat rarely reached every corner of the house equally. Bedrooms often remained chilly until the moment someone slipped beneath layers of blankets, and many people relied on hot water bottles or warmed bedpans placed beneath the sheets. Shortly before bedtime, summer brought different challenges altogether. Without electric fans or air conditioning, upper rooms became surprisingly warm, particularly beneath slate roofs baking in the afternoon sun. Windows were opened whenever possible, though doing so also invited soot, smoke, and the endless sounds of London into otherwise peaceful rooms. Flies buzzed around kitchens where fresh meat could spoil rapidly if meals were delayed. Milk was delivered daily because it could not remain fresh for long. Butter softened quickly, and cooks learned countless methods to preserve food despite the limitations of the age. Ice, when available, was treated almost as a luxury rather than something ordinary. Large blocks harvested during winter and stored in insulated ice houses gradually melted throughout the warmer months, allowing only the wealthiest households occasional access to chilled drinks or desserts. One hidden feature of many Victorian homes was the incredible amount of storage built into them. Cupboards, pantries, linen closets, attic trunks, cellar shelves, and locked cabinets filled every available space. Families believed in keeping almost everything that might someday prove useful. Empty jars were saved for preserves. Pieces of ribbon were folded carefully for future wrapping. Worn clothing might be altered, patched, or handed down to younger children or servants. Even broken furniture was often repaired rather than discarded. Wastefulness was considered both expensive and morally questionable. A respectable household demonstrated careful management by making belongings last as long as possible. The pantry itself was almost like a miniature world hidden behind thick wooden doors. Shelves held flour, sugar, dried peas, tea, spices, jams, pickles, bottled fruits, smoked meats, and carefully labelled containers arranged with impressive order. Every item had its designated place, because confusion wasted valuable time. Mice were constant enemies, forcing families to store food in tightly sealed tins whenever possible. The cook knew exactly how much remained of every ingredient, and often kept written inventories to prevent shortages before important dinners or holidays. Victorian homes also depended heavily upon bells and speaking tubes that quietly connected different parts of the house. In the drawing room, the lady of the house could pull a decorative cord, causing a small bell to ring downstairs in the servants' hall. Each bell corresponded to a particular room, allowing servants to know precisely where they were needed without family members shouting through hallways. In larger houses, speaking tubes allowed voices to travel between floors, creating a surprisingly sophisticated communication system decades before telephones became common. Visitors admired elegant furniture, without realizing that hidden behind walls were networks of wires, bells, and mechanisms keeping the household functioning smoothly. Laundry remained one of the most exhausting weekly tasks imaginable. Unlike modern washing machines completing the work with the push of a button, Victorian laundry required nearly an entire day of relentless physical effort. Water had to be heated over coal fires in enormous copper boilers, clothes soaked for hours before being scrubbed by hand against washboards. Soap stung cracked fingers while steam filled the room until windows dripped with condensation. Heavy blankets and sheets became astonishingly difficult to lift once soaked with water. After rinsing, every item was wrung out manually before hanging on lines stretched across courtyards or attic drying rooms. Ironing came afterward using heavy cast, iron irons heated repeatedly over the stove. Servants sometimes ironed for hours, carefully avoiding scorch marks that could ruin expensive garments. Clothing itself revealed countless hidden details about daily life. Getting dressed was rarely quick. Ladies wore layers beginning with undergarments, stockings, corsets, petticoats, skirts, bodices, collars, cuffs, jewellery, gloves, and carefully arranged hairstyles. Buttons, hooks, ribbons, and laces often required assistance from maids. Gentlemen also followed elaborate routines involving waistcoats, cravats, polished boots, pocket watches, hats, and tailored coats. Every crease mattered. A poorly tied cravat or dusty boot could leave an unfortunate impression during social visits. Looking respectable required patience long before anyone stepped outside. Visitors seldom noticed another secret hidden throughout the house. Sound travelled in curious ways. Thick carpets softened footsteps in reception rooms, while narrow staircases creaked despite every effort to silence them. Clock chimes echoed through hallways every hour, marking the passing of time with comforting regularity. Rain tapping against windows sounded almost musical during quiet evenings, while strong winds occasionally whistled through chimneys. In the kitchen below, pots clanged, knives chopped vegetables rhythmically, and servants exchanged quick conversations before falling silent whenever footsteps approached. Each floor possessed its own soundtrack, creating layers of daily life rarely appreciated by outsiders. Books occupied an increasingly important place inside prosperous Victorian homes. Shelves displayed leather-bound volumes of history, poetry, travel, science, and religion. Owning books demonstrated education as much as wealth. Evenings often ended with someone reading aloud while others listened attentively beside the fire. Charles Dickens, whose novels frequently described London's contrasting worlds of poverty and prosperity, became a familiar presence in many drawing rooms. Families laughed, debated characters, and occasionally shed tears over fictional stories that reflected real social concerns. Reading together strengthened family bonds during long evenings when darkness arrived early. Music filled many houses just as naturally as conversation. The piano became one of the most prized possessions a middle-class family could own. Daughters practiced scales diligently because musical ability was considered an essential accomplishment. Friends gathered around the instrument after dinner to sing popular songs or hymns while someone accompanied them on the keyboard. There were no recorded albums waiting at the touch of a button. Every note heard within the house came directly from human hands and voices, making music feel deeply personal rather than simply background entertainment. Letters carried enormous emotional importance because they connected families separated by distance. Every morning, anticipation often centered upon the arrival of the postman. A single envelope might contain news from relatives living in Scotland, soldiers serving overseas, merchants travelling across Europe, or sons studying at university. Families sometimes read letters aloud together before carefully folding them and tying them with ribbon for safekeeping. Entire bundles accumulated over decades, preserving conversations long after the writers themselves had passed away. Illness transformed the atmosphere of the house almost instantly. Curtains remained partly closed to create quiet rooms where patients could rest. Fires burned continuously to maintain warmth. Medicines lined bedside tables beside teaspoons, thermometers, and pitchers of water. Family members walked softly through corridors, while servants whispered rather than spoke normally. Doctors arrived carrying leather bags filled with instruments and medicines that reflected the medical knowledge of the era, some effective, others far less so. Recovery depended as much upon rest, nutrition, and good fortune as upon treatment itself. Every cough or fever caused understandable concern in an age before antibiotics. Despite appearances of order, disagreements naturally occurred within Victorian households. Financial worries, disagreements over children's education, servant mistakes, or social obligations occasionally created tension behind closed doors. Yet public displays of anger were generally discouraged. Respectability required emotional restraint, encouraging people to resolve conflicts privately whenever possible. Neighbours might never suspect arguments had occurred only hours before, because calm manners quickly returned whenever the front door opened to visitors. Pets also found their place within many London homes. Dogs rested near fireplaces, waiting patiently for walks through nearby parks, while cats quietly hunted mice that ventured into kitchens or cellars. Singing canaries brightened drawing rooms with cheerful melodies, and aquariums containing goldfish became fashionable decorative features during the Victorian period. Children formed deep attachments to these animals, often considering them trusted companions within otherwise highly structured households. As darkness faded into another pale London dawn, the house slowly prepared to repeat its familiar rhythm once again. Before the family opened their eyes, the city itself was already awake. Milk carts rattled over uneven cobblestones, Bakery ovens glowed with fresh fires, and the distant whistles of steam locomotives echoed across the capital. The growing railway network had transformed Britain, allowing food, newspapers, letters, and travellers to arrive faster than ever before. Inside the house, however, time still seemed to move according to older traditions. The comforting routines changed little from one day to the next, creating a sense of stability in a rapidly changing world. One of the quietest moments in the house occurred just after sunrise. For a few precious minutes, the drawing room stood perfectly still. Chairs waited neatly arranged around the fireplace, curtains allowed soft morning light to enter, and yesterday's newspaper rested folded on a polished table. Dust floated gently through thin beams of sunlight before servants appeared with feather dusters to erase every trace of it. This peaceful scene lasted only briefly. Within an hour, footsteps echoed through corridors, doors opened and closed, breakfast trays moved between rooms, and another carefully managed day began. Victorian families paid remarkable attention to the condition of their furniture. A dining table was not simply a place to eat, but a valuable investment expected to last for generations. Mahogany, walnut, and oak were polished so frequently that their surfaces reflected candlelight. Almost like mirrors, upholstered chairs were brushed to remove dust, and delicate lace coverings protected the backs of sofas from oils in people's hair. Children were constantly reminded not to drag chairs across wooden floors or place wet glasses directly onto polished surfaces. Respect for household possessions was considered a sign of good upbringing. Wallpaper covered many interior walls with elaborate floral patterns, geometric designs, or elegant stripes. These decorative papers added warmth and sophistication, yet they also trapped soot from London's coal smoke. Over time, even beautifully decorated rooms slowly darkened beneath layers of invisible grime. Every few years, prosperous families replaced faded wallpaper entirely, not because fashions had changed dramatically, but because the smoke of everyday life had gradually dulled its colours. The windows of a Victorian house offered a fascinating view of London's changing seasons. During spring, flower sellers passed carrying colourful blooms destined for drawing rooms across the city. Summer brought children playing in nearby squares, while horses pulled open carriages beneath bright skies. Autumn filled the streets with fallen leaves mixed among the mud left by constant traffic. Winter transformed the view into one of chimney smoke, thick fog, and people wrapped tightly in heavy coats hurrying through the cold. Families often spent quiet moments simply watching life unfold beyond the glass, observing a city that seemed endlessly busy, no matter the weather. Servants developed extraordinary skills that rarely received public recognition. A butler could remember the preferred seating arrangements of dozens of guests without consulting written notes. A cook knew precisely how long every roast required, despite having no modern oven thermostat. Housemaids learned how to remove stubborn stains using mixtures of vinegar, lemon juice, chalk, or soap long before commercial cleaning products existed. Their knowledge came through years of experience rather than formal education, passed from one generation of domestic workers to the next. The nursery possessed its own unique atmosphere entirely separate from the formal elegance downstairs. Here, children's books lay scattered across small tables, wooden blocks formed miniature castles, dolls rested in tiny beds, and rocking horses waited patiently in corners. Laughter echoed more freely than anywhere else in the house, though even here rules remained plentiful. Toys were expected to be tidied away before bedtime. Lessons took priority over games, and good manners were practiced almost as carefully as reading and writing. Childhood contained moments of joy, but it was always preparing children for the responsibilities of adulthood. Rainy days transformed life indoors. London was famous for sudden showers, and families often found themselves remaining inside for hours at a time. Windows misted over while fireplaces burned steadily despite the season. Ladies devoted afternoons to embroidery, gentlemen caught up on correspondence or financial records, and children entertained themselves with board games, puzzles, or reading aloud. The steady rhythm of raindrops against the windows became almost soothing, encouraging conversations that might never have occurred during busier days. The house also contained countless small rituals that everyone followed without questioning. Hats were removed immediately upon entering. Wet umbrellas were left in designated stands near the entrance. Boots were cleaned before muddy footprints reached carpets. Calling cards were presented during social visits and carefully stored by the lady of the house. Guests never wandered freely through private rooms, but remained within spaces intended for entertaining. These customs created an invisible structure that governed daily life as surely as walls and doors. A fascinating aspect of Victorian living was how every room possessed its own distinct personality. The library encouraged quiet reflection. The dining room emphasized formality and conversation. The kitchen overflowed with practical energy. The nursery welcomed learning and play. Bedrooms offered privacy in a society that otherwise valued constant self-gen control. Even hallways served more than one purpose, displaying family portraits, decorative tables, and carefully chosen artwork that silently introduced visitors to the household's taste and social standing. Family portraits occupied places of honor throughout many homes, painted long before photography became widespread and affordable. These portraits represented treasured connections across generations. Grandparents who had passed away continued watching silently from ornate frames, reminding younger family members of their heritage and responsibilities. Later, as photography became increasingly common during the Victorian era, small photographs began appearing in albums and decorative cases, preserving moments with remarkable realism for the first time. Visitors often admired the beauty of Victorian curtains without realizing how practical they were. Heavy fabrics blocked cold drafts during winter, reduced sunlight that faded expensive carpets, softened echoes within large rooms, and provided privacy from busy streets outside. Drawing the curtains each evening became a familiar ritual, marking the transition from public daylight to private family time. The smell of fresh ink frequently drifted through studies and writing desks, where letters, invitations, household accounts, and personal journals were written by hand. Steel nib pens required regular dipping into ink bottles, making neat handwriting a valuable skill. Blotting paper rested nearby to prevent smudges before pages dried. Every letter demanded careful thought because mistakes could not simply be erased with a keyboard. Words were chosen slowly, reflecting an age when written communication carried lasting importance. By candlelight, shadows transformed familiar rooms into entirely different spaces. Decorative carvings seemed deeper. Portraits appeared almost lifelike, and polished furniture reflected dancing flames across dark ceilings. Without bright electric lighting, evenings possessed a softness that encouraged quieter voices and slower movements. Families naturally gathered closer together because only the immediate area around lamps and fireplaces remained brightly illuminated. Outside, London continued growing at an astonishing pace. New neighbourhoods expanded, factories multiplied, bridges crossed the Thames, and railway stations welcomed thousands of passengers every day. Yet behind the doors of countless Victorian houses, traditions remained remarkably consistent. Parents still corrected children's manners at the dinner table. Servants still rose before dawn to light fires. Mothers still balanced household budgets with careful precision. Fathers still returned home, carrying the unseen weight of business responsibilities. Generations changed, fashions evolved, and technology advanced. But the daily heartbeat of the Victorian household continued almost unchanged. Perhaps this explains why these houses still capture our imagination today. Their brick walls witnessed far more than elegant dinner parties and afternoon tea. They sheltered newborn babies taking their first breaths, children learning to read beside nursery windows, young couples beginning married life, elderly grandparents sharing stories beside glowing fireplaces, servants quietly sacrificing comfort to provide it for others, and families celebrating moments of happiness while enduring seasons of sorrow. Every staircase remembered countless footsteps. Every fireplace warmed generations of hands through long winters. Every window framed a different chapter in the endless story of Victorian London. If you could somehow spend a single quiet evening inside one of these homes, you might initially notice only the polished furniture, flickering candles, and graceful manners that have become symbols of the Victorian age. But if you stayed a little longer, listening carefully beyond the formal conversations, you would begin to hear the real heartbeat of the house. The distant clatter of dishes being washed in the kitchen, the gentle ticking of clocks measuring another passing hour, the soft footsteps of servants completing one last task, fading down woo. Even on the quietest days, a Victorian house never truly stood still. Somewhere, something always needed attention. A loose hinge squeaked every time the pantry door opened. A fireplace grate required polishing before visitors arrived. A cracked teacup had to be quietly replaced before the afternoon tea service. A curtain hem needed mending after brushing against muddy boots. These tiny jobs rarely seemed important on their own. Yet together they consumed countless hours. Running a respectable London household in the 1850s meant noticing small imperfections before anyone else did. Success was measured not by grand achievements, but by the absence of visible disorder. The front hallway served as the first impression of the family. It was designed to communicate respectability before a single word had been spoken. Umbrella stands stood neatly beside the entrance. Hats were arranged carefully on polished hooks, and a mirror reflected both arriving guests and the afternoon light entering through decorative glass panels. During rainy weather, servants hurried to wipe away muddy footprints before they dried into stubborn stains. Every knock upon the front door triggered a familiar routine. A servant answered promptly, accepted coats and walking sticks, announced visitors by name, and guided them into the appropriate room. Hospitality followed a carefully rehearsed rhythm that had been refined over many years. The staircase, often overlooked by modern visitors, was one of the busiest places in the entire house. Throughout a single day, servants might climb and descend, it dozens of times, carrying fresh linens, buckets of coal, trays of food, clean towels, hot water, letters, sewing baskets, or polished shoes. Their footsteps became so familiar that family members barely noticed them anymore. To the servants themselves, every journey represented another piece of invisible work that kept the household running smoothly. The clocks scattered throughout the house quietly ruled everyone's lives. Nearly every respectable home contained several timepieces, each requiring regular winding. Their gentle ticking filled otherwise silent rooms, reminding everyone that punctuality was a virtue deeply admired during the Victorian age. Breakfast began at a certain hour. Calling on friends took place within accepted visiting times. Dinner was expected promptly. Servants timed meals with remarkable precision because arriving even a few minutes late reflected poorly upon the entire household. Life moved according to the steady rhythm of clock, hands long before digital calendars and alarms existed. Fresh flowers often brightened drawing rooms despite London's smoky atmosphere. Garden roses, lilies, lavender, or seasonal blossoms were arranged carefully in decorative vases placed upon mantelpieces and side tables. Beyond their beauty, flowers added pleasant fragrances that softened the ever-present smell of coal fires. Families appreciated nature whenever possible, even if it entered the home only through a small bouquet resting beside the fireplace. The dining table itself became a stage upon which Victorian manners were performed every evening. Conversation remained thoughtful rather than loud. Elbows stayed off the table. Napkins rested neatly across laps. Children learned exactly which fork belonged to each course and waited patiently until everyone had been served before beginning to eat. Such rules may appear strict today, yet Victorians believed they encouraged patience, consideration, and self-discipline. Every family meal doubled as a lesson in proper behaviour. After dinner, gentlemen sometimes withdrew to discuss business, politics, or current events, while ladies continued conversations in the drawing room over tea. Newspapers sparked lively debates about railway expansion, discoveries in science, changing fashions and events across the growing British Empire. London in the 1850s stood at the centre of a rapidly changing world, and many families followed these developments with genuine curiosity. Although their homes seemed peaceful, they remained deeply connected to events occurring far beyond the city's streets. Bookshelves slowly expanded as families accumulated volumes throughout their lives. Each book often carried a personal history. A leather-bound Bible might have been given as a wedding gift decades earlier. A favourite novel could remind someone of childhood evenings spent reading beside a parent. A travel journal might preserve memories of a long-forgotten holiday. These books were not merely decorations, but companions passed carefully from one generation to the next. Sundays possessed an atmosphere unlike any other day of the week. The house felt quieter from the moment everyone awoke. Bells from nearby churches echoed across London, inviting families to morning services. Clothing chosen for Sunday was often the finest in the wardrobe, carefully brushed and pressed the evening before. After church, families gathered for substantial meals before spending the afternoon reading, walking through parks if weather permitted, or quietly visiting relatives. Many forms of work and entertainment paused, allowing the household to experience a rare sense of calm after the busy routines of the week. The relationship between employers and servants was often more complicated than appearances suggested. While strict social boundaries remained firmly in place, many families relied upon the same servants for years or even decades. A cook might prepare meals for children who eventually grew into adults and later cooked for their own children. A housemaid could witness engagements, weddings, births, illnesses, and funerals, becoming a silent observer of an entire family's history. Though rarely treated as equals, trusted servants often knew the household more intimately than many distant relatives. Winter evenings were perhaps the most memorable. Outside, dense fog rolled slowly through London's streets, softening the glow of gas lamps until they appeared as blurred golden circles floating in the darkness. Horse-drawn carriages emerged only moments before passing the windows, their wheels crunching softly across damp roads. Inside, the contrast could not have been greater. Firelight flickered warmly across polished wood, tea steamed gently from delicate cups, and family members gathered together beneath the reassuring shelter of thick brick walls. The outside world seemed distant, almost forgotten for a few peaceful hours. As midnight approached, silence gradually settled over every room. The kitchen fire faded into glowing embers. Hallway lamps were extinguished one after another. Curtains remained tightly closed against the cool night air. Somewhere high above, in modest attic bedrooms, exhausted servants finally rested after nearly 18 hours of work. Downstairs, the family slept comfortably, unaware that another day's comfort had depended upon countless unseen tasks performed with quiet efficiency. Years passed, children became adults, fashions changed, and London continued expanding into one of the greatest cities on earth. Yet within these houses, memories quietly accumulated. A scratch on the banister recalled generations of hands sliding down the stairs as children. A faint stain hidden beneath an old carpet marked the place where a Christmas tree had once stood many winters before. The dining room remembered birthdays, engagements, farewells, and celebrations that no visitor could possibly imagine simply by looking at its polished table. Eventually, many of these families moved away or disappeared, their possessions sold, their letters boxed away, and their names gradually forgotten. Some houses became offices, boarding homes, or apartments. Others survived wars, renovations, and changing neighbourhoods. Yet if those old walls could somehow speak, they would tell stories not of kings or famous politicians, but of ordinary mornings filled with the smell of fresh bread, quiet evenings illuminated by candlelight, children laughing in nurseries, servants climbing endless staircases, mothers balancing household accounts, fathers returning home weary from the city, and countless simple moments that together formed the hidden heartbeat of Victorian London. That is perhaps the greatest secret hidden inside London's houses during the 1850s. They were never merely buildings of brick, timber, and glass. They were living worlds unto themselves, each with its own routines, traditions, personalities, joys, disappointments, and dreams. Behind every elegant front door existed a private universe that most passers-by never saw, a world sustained by discipline, warmed by family, shaped by invisible labour, and remembered today not because of spectacular events, but because of the quiet beauty found in ordinary life lived one day at a time. As evening deepened and the last carriage wheels faded into the distance, the house settled into a silence that modern cities rarely experience. There was no glow from television screens behind curtains, no hum of refrigerators, and no distant buzz of electronics. Instead, The loudest sounds were often the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, the soft crackle of a dying fire, or the wind brushing gently against the chimney pots above the roof. In these quiet hours, every creak of the old timber seemed louder than it really was, reminding those awake that the house itself had a character built over decades of daily life. For older members of the family, night-time often became a moment for reflection. Sitting beside the fading fire, they might think about how much London had changed within their own lifetime. Many remembered a city with fewer railways, quieter streets, and smaller neighbourhoods. Before the great wave of industrial expansion transformed the capital into the largest city in the world. New factories, bridges, stations, and warehouses seemed to appear every year. Entire districts grew where open fields had once existed. Yet despite all this change outside, the routines inside the home remained reassuringly familiar. That sense of continuity gave families comfort in an age of remarkable progress. The youngest children often viewed the house as an enormous place filled with mysteries. Long corridors seemed endless after sunset, and staircases appeared much steeper when lit only by a single candle. Every closed door invited curiosity. The attic held forgotten trunks, whose contents inspired endless imagination. The cellar felt almost like another world, cool and shadowy, where stacks of coal, barrels, and preserved foods waited quietly in the darkness. Even ordinary cupboards became exciting hiding places during games. To a child growing up in a Victorian home, the house itself was almost an adventure waiting to be explored. As children became teenagers, those same rooms began to represent responsibility rather than mystery. Young ladies practiced the social skills expected of them, learning how to receive visitors with confidence, write graceful letters, host afternoon tea, and manage household duties they might someday oversee themselves. Young gentlemen prepared for careers in business, law, engineering, medicine, or the military. Parents understood that childhood was brief and adulthood arrived quickly, so every lesson taught within the home was considered an investment in the future. Many evenings were devoted to conversation rather than entertainment. Families discussed newspaper articles describing archaeological discoveries in Egypt, scientific inventions, political debates in Parliament, or reports arriving from across the British Empire. The Victorian period was an age fascinated by knowledge. New museums opened, libraries expanded, and public lectures attracted enthusiastic audiences. Curiosity reached into the home itself, where even ordinary families enjoyed learning about distant countries, new technologies, and remarkable explorers whose adventures filled newspapers and books. Maps were surprisingly common in educated households. Some hung framed upon walls, while others rested folded inside books or writing desks. Fathers often showed children where ships carrying tea or spices had travelled, tracing routes across oceans with a fingertip. For many London families, the world felt increasingly connected as steamships and railways reduced journeys that once required months. Although few people travelled great distances themselves, they followed the expanding world with genuine fascination from the comfort of their own drawing rooms. One of the most treasured possessions in many homes was the family Bible. Beyond its religious significance, its opening pages often contained handwritten records of births, marriages, and deaths, stretching back through several generations before official records became widespread. These carefully written entries preserved the family's own history. Children sometimes turned those pages with wonder, seeing the names of grandparents and great-grandparents they had never known. In many ways, the Bible served not only as a religious book, but also as the family's earliest photo album and historical record. Even the smallest decorative objects often carried sentimental meaning. A porcelain figurine might have been purchased during a honeymoon years earlier. A silver brooch could have belonged to a beloved grandmother. A carved wooden box might contain dozens of carefully folded letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Unlike today's culture of frequent replacement, Victorians often formed lasting attachments to possessions. Because each object accumulated memories over time, the house also reflected the rhythm of the natural world far more than modern homes. Sunrise determined when work began, especially during summer. Sunset encouraged evenings around the fireplace because artificial lighting remained limited and expensive. Storms could darken rooms in the middle of the afternoon, requiring lamps to be lit unexpectedly. Snow muffled the sounds of passing horses, creating an almost magical quietness beyond the windows. Every season left its own unmistakable mark upon daily life. During particularly foggy mornings, London seemed almost to disappear. Thick yellow-grey fog drifted between buildings, swallowing church towers and reducing visibility to only a few yards. Inside the house, servants lit lamps much earlier than usual, while windows remained closed against the smoky air. Conversations naturally became softer as everyone moved carefully through the dim light. These famous London fogs became so much a part of Victorian life that families simply adjusted their routines rather than treating them as unusual events. The household also relied heavily upon trust. The butler might manage expensive wine collections worth a small fortune. The housekeeper often controlled household purchases and supervised valuable linens, silverware, and furniture. Cooks handled costly ingredients every day. Families depended upon honesty because constant supervision would have been impossible. Reputation therefore mattered enormously for domestic servants. A trusted servant could remain with one family for an entire working life, earning deep respect through years of faithful service. As decades passed, photographs gradually became more common inside London homes. Carefully arranged family portraits replaced some painted miniatures, allowing ordinary people to preserve remarkably lifelike images of loved ones for the first time. These photographs were treated with extraordinary care. They rested inside velvet albums, decorative frames, or elegant cases displayed proudly upon mantelpieces. Visitors often spent afternoons turning album pages together, recalling weddings, holidays, and relatives living far away. When illness or old age finally touched the household, the home adapted with quiet dignity. Favourite chairs were moved closer to fireplaces for warmth. Meals became simpler. Relatives travelled across the city to visit. The drawing room that had hosted cheerful conversations might suddenly become a place of quiet reflection. Victorian houses witnessed every stage of human life, from the cries of newborn babies to the final farewells of elderly grandparents, and their rooms silently absorbed those memories without revealing them to anyone outside. By the late hours of the night, London itself seemed to breathe more slowly. Policemen carrying lanterns walked regular patrols through sleeping neighbourhoods. Bakers had already begun preparing tomorrow's bread. Newspaper presses rumbled in distant buildings, printing stories that would be read over breakfast only a few hours later inside the house. However, Complete stillness finally arrived. Fires glowed faintly beneath layers of ash, prepared to be rekindled before dawn. Every bedroom door remained closed. Every clock continued faithfully, measuring the hours until morning returned. If someone from the modern world could quietly wander through one of these London houses in the 1850s without disturbing its occupants, they might first admire the furniture, the elegant wallpaper, the polished silver, and the graceful architecture. But after lingering long enough, they would discover that the greatest treasures were never the expensive objects decorating the rooms. The real wealth of the house lived in its routines. The cook rising before daylight every morning, without complaint, the mother remembering every birthday and family tradition, the father kissing his children goodnight after a long day in the city, the servants working together with practiced efficiency, and generations gathering around the same table year after year. These ordinary moments rarely appeared in paintings or newspapers because they seemed too commonplace to record. Yet they formed the true foundation of Victorian domestic life. Behind every respectable brick townhouse stood thousands of unnoticed acts of kindness, responsibility, patience, and perseverance. It was these quiet moments, far more than the grand banquets or fashionable parties, that gave London's houses their warmth and humanity. Hidden behind lace curtains and polished front doors was not simply a Victorian home, but a living world where every day, no matter how ordinary it seemed, quietly became part of history. There were also countless little habits that visitors almost never noticed because the family performed them so naturally. Every evening, boots left near the entrance were quietly collected, cleaned, polished until they reflected the firelight, and returned before morning. Candlesticks were scraped free of hardened wax, their brass polished until no fingerprints remained. Ink bottles were refilled, fireplaces swept, and yesterday's ashes carried away before anyone downstairs had awakened. By breakfast, the evidence of the previous day had almost completely vanished, creating the illusion that the house somehow renewed itself overnight. The windows of the upper floors revealed another side of Victorian London that few people discussed. Looking down from a bedroom late at night, you could watch the city continuing its endless rhythm. A lone policeman carrying a lantern disappeared into the fog. A doctor hurried by in a horse-drawn cab after being summoned to a sick patient. Market wagons creaked toward Covent Garden long before sunrise, bringing vegetables, flowers, and fruit into the city, while most families still slept. Occasionally, the distant whistle of a locomotive drifted across the rooftops, reminding everyone that London was connected to places that earlier generations could scarcely imagine reaching in a single day. Within the walls of the house, birthdays were celebrated with far less extravagance than many modern parties, yet they carried deep meaning. A homemade cake, carefully wrapped presents, a special family dinner, and perhaps a few close relatives visiting in the afternoon were enough to create lasting memories. Children eagerly counted the days until such occasions arrived, not because they expected mountains of gifts, but because the day's routines briefly became something special. Even adults appreciated these simple celebrations, seeing them as welcome pauses in otherwise disciplined lives. Wedding preparations transformed an entire household into a place of joyful activity. Seamstresses arrived to make final alterations to dresses. Invitations were written by hand. Silverware received an extra polishing, and relatives travelled from surrounding counties to stay for several days. Spare bedrooms filled quickly, hallways echoed with unfamiliar voices, and kitchens worked from dawn until late evening preparing meals for the growing number of guests. After the wedding, however, the house gradually returned to its familiar quiet rhythm, leaving only photographs, flowers beginning to fade, and treasured memories of the celebration. Not every story inside these homes was a happy one. Illness remained an unavoidable part of life in the 19th century. Diseases that are easily treated today could become serious or even fatal. Families lived with an awareness that health could change unexpectedly. When someone became ill, ordinary routines slowed. Curtains were drawn to soften bright sunlight. Footsteps became quieter, and conversations moved into whispers outside bedroom doors. Neighbours often sent soups, bread, or flowers as gestures of support, reflecting the strong sense of community that existed in many London neighbourhoods. The smell of medicine was unmistakable in such moments. Herbal mixtures, vinegar, camphor, and various remedies filled the sick room, while clocks seemed to tick more loudly in the silence. Family members took turns sitting beside the bed through long nights, reading quietly, or simply keeping watch. These moments revealed another hidden strength of Victorian households: the deep commitment family members often showed one another during difficult times. Children growing up in these homes gradually became familiar with every hidden corner. They knew exactly which stair creaked the loudest, where sunlight entered first on summer mornings, which window offered the best view of snowfall, and which cupboard contained homemade biscuits if the cook happened to be feeling generous. To them, the house was not an architectural masterpiece, but the entire world of their childhood. Years later, many adults could remember the scent of polished wood in the hallway, or the pattern of wallpaper in the nursery, with astonishing clarity. Even pets developed routines that blended naturally into household life. The family dog waited faithfully near the front door every afternoon, recognizing the familiar hour when its master usually returned from work. Cats stretched lazily beside fireplaces before disappearing into kitchens in search of mice. Birds perched in decorative cages greeted the morning with cheerful songs that echoed softly through otherwise quiet rooms. These animals became part of the household's daily rhythm, offering companionship without demanding much in return. London itself was becoming increasingly noisy as industry expanded, yet thick brick walls sheltered families surprisingly well inside. Conversations could continue peacefully, while outside thousands of carts, horses, factory workers, and street vendors filled the roads with activity. During particularly heavy fogs, these outside sounds became strangely muted, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere where the city seemed hidden behind a curtain of mist. Families often remarked that such evenings felt unusually peaceful, despite knowing millions of people lived only a short distance away. Every Christmas, familiar decorations emerged from carefully stored boxes in the attic. Handmade ornaments wrapped in tissue paper, ribbons saved from previous years, polished candle holders, and treasured family decorations appeared once again. Children eagerly helped decorate the Christmas tree, carefully placing each ornament, while adults prepared festive meals in kitchens already warm from hours of cooking. These traditions connected one generation to the next, ensuring that children experienced many of the same customs their parents had enjoyed years earlier. During long winter evenings, storytelling became a favourite pastime. Grandparents shared memories of London before the railways arrived, describing quieter streets, slower journeys, and shops that had long since disappeared. Children listened with fascination, struggling to imagine a city without massive stations, steam engines, or endless rows of chimneys. These stories preserved family history in a way no written record could fully capture. As years passed, every member of the household left invisible traces behind. A child who once raced laughing through the corridors eventually grew into the gentleman leaving each morning for business. The young maid nervously beginning her first position gradually became the experienced housekeeper trusted with every important responsibility. Elderly grandparents who once occupied favourite chairs quietly disappeared from daily life, yet their portraits continued watching over future generations from the drawing room walls. Perhaps the greatest hidden secret of London's houses in the 1850s was that they contained far more emotion than Victorian society openly admitted. Behind formal manners existed deep affection between parents and children, lifelong friendships between servants working together for decades, quiet romances beginning over afternoon tea, heartbreaking farewells at railway stations, joyful reunions after long journeys, anxious nights waiting for good news, and moments of laughter so genuine that they echoed through hallways long after guests had departed. Respectability may have governed public behaviour, but private family life remained filled with the same hopes, fears, ambitions, and love that people experience today. Eventually, the candles burned low, the final embers in the fireplace faded into darkness, and the entire house rested beneath the London night. Outside, the great city continued expanding, building new streets, inventing new technologies, and welcoming thousands of newcomers each year. Inside, however, another ordinary day had quietly come to an end. A day that no newspaper would report, no historian would record, and no monument would commemorate. Yet it was these ordinary days, repeated thousands of times behind brick walls across Victorian London, that truly defined life in the 1850s. The grand events of history shaped the city from above. But it was within these warm, carefully ordered homes that history was actually lived. One quiet morning, one family meal, and one peaceful evening at a time. And when the family finally drifted into sleep, the house did not become completely lifeless. Coal fires, carefully banked beneath a layer of ash, continued glowing faintly through the night, preserving enough heat to be revived before dawn. The grandfather clock in the hallway steadily counted each passing hour, its pendulum swinging with unwavering precision. Outside, rain occasionally tapped against the window panes, while the wind slipped around chimney pots, producing soft whistles that became familiar companions during long winter nights. Every sound seemed magnified by the darkness. Yet those who had lived in the house for years barely noticed them. They had become part of the home's own quiet language before sunrise. The cycle began again. The first servant downstairs often woke while the rest of London remained wrapped in darkness. Lighting the kitchen range was one of the day's most important tasks, because almost everything depended upon it. Without a hot fire, there could be no warm water, no breakfast, no baked bread, and no comfortable sitting rooms. The The servant carefully arranged coal and kindling before blowing gently across glowing embers preserved from the previous evening. Slowly the fire came alive, filling the kitchen with warmth while the smell of burning coals spread gently through the lower floors. Soon afterward came another familiar ritual. Heavy curtains were drawn back one room at a time, allowing pale morning light to enter. During summer this happened early, but in winter the lamps often remained necessary long after breakfast had begun. London mornings frequently arrived beneath grey skies, and the smoke rising from thousands of chimneys softened the sunlight before it reached the streets below. The city rarely appeared brilliantly bright. Instead, everything seemed wrapped in a gentle haze that became one of Victorian London's most recognisable features. The kitchen quickly transformed into the busiest room in the house. Bread dough was kneaded on large wooden tables dusted with flour. Bacon sizzled over the range while kettles began to whistle softly. Fresh vegetables delivered the previous afternoon were sorted and prepared for later meals. Eggs collected from nearby farms arrived in wicker baskets lined with straw. Every movement followed a rhythm developed through years of experience. There was little wasted motion because every minute mattered. Meanwhile, upstairs remained surprisingly peaceful. Bedrooms still held the quiet warmth left beneath thick blankets. Dressing tables reflected the first light of day in polished mirrors, while neatly folded clothing waited exactly where servants had placed it the night before. Hairbrushes, silver, backed mirrors, perfume bottles, cufflinks, pocket watches, and neatly arranged jewellery rested patiently upon polished wooden surfaces. Each object had its proper place, and disorder was corrected almost immediately whenever it appeared. As family members gradually emerged from their rooms, the house came fully alive. Doors opened, conversations began, footsteps echoed along corridors, and the familiar scent of breakfast drifted upward through the stairwell. Newspapers arrived folded beneath the front door, carrying reports from Parliament, shipping news from distant ports, announcements of births and marriages, advertisements for new inventions and stories of crimes that fascinated Victorian readers. The father often unfolded the newspaper before taking his first sip of tea, quietly beginning his connection with the outside world before leaving for work. Children experienced mornings rather differently. They hurried through washing and dressing under the watchful eyes of nurses or governesses before gathering for lessons. Their schoolroom often contained maps, globes, slates, chalkboards, dictionaries, and carefully arranged books covering geography, arithmetic, grammar, history, and scripture. Lessons demanded concentration, but there were moments when attention wandered toward the window, especially if snow had begun falling or birds gathered in the garden outside. For daughters, education extended beyond academic subjects. Music lessons occupied many afternoons as fingers practiced scales repeatedly upon polished piano keys. Embroidery demanded remarkable patience, producing delicate patterns stitched onto linen handkerchiefs, tablecloths, and decorative cushions. French conversation, drawing, painting, and graceful handwriting were all considered valuable accomplishments that reflected refinement and education. Although these activities appear leisurely today, they required dedication and countless hours of careful practice. The servants' dining room, hidden away from the family's elegant spaces, possessed an entirely different atmosphere. Meals were simpler, conversations more relaxed, and laughter more frequent when duties briefly allowed it. Here the cook exchanged stories with the housemaid, the butler discussed deliveries arriving later that day, and younger servants quietly listened while learning the routines of household life. Despite their hard work, these moments provided a welcome sense of companionship before everyone returned to their separate responsibilities. Visitors who entered through the polished front door rarely imagined how many unseen hands had prepared the house before their arrival. They admired gleaming silver, spotless carpets, fragrant flowers, arranged in crystal vases, and perfectly folded napkins without considering the hours of invisible labor required to create such effortless elegance. Every polished surface represented someone's careful attention. Every comfortable chair had been dusted. Every curtain had been straightened. Every fireplace had been cleaned. The true achievement of the household lay in making extraordinary effort appear completely ordinary as afternoon. Sunlight slowly crossed the drawing-room floor. It illuminated tiny particles of dust floating gently through the air. Even in the cleanest Victorian homes, dust was impossible to eliminate entirely, because London's coal smoke settled constantly upon every surface. Servants accepted this endless battle almost as part of nature itself. No sooner had one room been cleaned than another required attention again. The family garden, no matter how small, offered a peaceful escape from the crowded city beyond. Flower beds contained roses, lavender, foxgloves, hollyhocks, and neatly trimmed shrubs. Ivy climbed brick walls while sparrows hopped between carefully maintained pathways. Garden benches invited quiet reading during pleasant weather, and children sometimes chased butterflies across the grass under the watchful eyes of nurses. Although surrounded by one of the busiest cities in the world, these private gardens created small islands of calm hidden behind high walls. By late afternoon, the changing angle of sunlight signaled another transition in household life. Lamps were prepared before darkness fully arrived. Curtains were drawn against the evening chill. Fires received fresh coal, filling sitting rooms once again with welcoming warmth. The familiar rituals repeated almost exactly as they had the day before, yet no one found them boring. Their predictability created comfort. In a rapidly changing century filled with industrial growth, political change, scientific discovery, and expanding cities, the home remained a place where familiar routines anchored everyday life. Looking back today, it is tempting to remember Victorian London only through its great landmarks, crowded streets, and famous historical figures. Yet the true spirit of the city lived quietly behind millions of closed doors. It lived in mothers carefully teaching children good manners, fathers returning home tired after long days of work, servants rising before dawn without complaint, grandparents sharing stories beside glowing fires, cooks preparing meals from simple ingredients, and families gathering together every evening beneath the soft glow of candlelight. These ordinary households rarely appeared in history books, yet they formed the foundation of Victorian society. Every respectable home contained its own hidden world, a world of discipline, kindness, routine, sacrifice, ambition, and quiet hope. From the outside, they appeared almost identical, with rows of brick passerbys stretching endlessly along London's streets. But inside each one existed a unique story, shaped not by grand historical events, but by the countless ordinary moments that slowly became a lifetime. And perhaps that is the greatest hidden truth about London houses in the 1850s. Behind every polished front door, history was not being watched. It was being quietly lived, one peaceful day after another. As one year blended quietly into the next, the house itself seemed to age alongside the family. The polished banister became smoother from thousands of hands sliding along it. The wooden steps developed shallow hollows, where countless footsteps had landed in exactly the same places every single day. Door hinges acquired familiar squeaks despite regular oiling, and sunlight slowly faded sections of wallpaper nearest the windows. None of these changes happened suddenly. They accumulated so gradually that those living inside hardly noticed them. Yet together they transformed a new house into a home rich with memories. Every object inside carried a story that outsiders. A simple porcelain teacup might have survived decades of family breakfasts without ever being broken. A silver pocket watch could have passed from father to son on an important birthday. An embroidered cushion resting quietly upon the sofa may have taken months of careful stitching by a young woman preparing for marriage. Even an ordinary dining chair might have witnessed thousands of conversations, celebrations, disagreements, and quiet evenings shared by generations of the same family. The fireplaces were perhaps the truest heart of the Victorian home. During winter, they offered warmth, light, and a natural gathering place. Children stretched out on rugs, reading adventure stories, while grandparents warmed their hands before glowing coals. Adults discussed business, politics, literature, or neighborhood gossip as flames danced behind iron grates. The gentle crackling of burning coal became one of the most familiar sounds in everyday life. Without these fireplaces, the great brick houses of London would have felt cold, silent, and unwelcoming for much of the year. The house also witnessed moments that no visitor ever saw. A child quietly practicing a difficult piano piece until finally playing it perfectly. A mother sitting alone late at night, finishing repairs to a torn school uniform before morning. A father carefully calculating household expenses by candlelight after everyone else had gone to bed. A servant pausing for a brief moment at an upstairs window to watch the first snowfall of winter before returning to work. These private moments rarely became part of written history, yet they filled Victorian homes with genuine humanity. Occasionally, exciting news arrived unexpectedly. A telegram delivered to the front door instantly captured everyone's attention, because such messages usually concerned urgent matters. The servant answering the door hurried to deliver the envelope, and the family gathered anxiously while it was opened. Good news brought smiles and immediate plans. Difficult news could change the entire mood of the household within seconds. Although letters remained the most common form of communication, telegrams introduced a new sense of speed that fascinated Victorians. The neighbourhood surrounding the house also formed part of everyday life. Families recognised familiar faces passing their windows each morning. The same baker delivered fresh bread. The same chimney sweep visited regularly. The same policeman nodded politely while walking his evening patrol. Children greeted one another on their way to lessons, while neighbours exchanged courteous conversations over garden fences or during afternoon walks. These repeated encounters created a quiet sense of belonging within London's enormous population. Weather influenced nearly every household routine. A heavy rainstorm delayed deliveries and filled entrance halls with damp coats and muddy boots. Bright summer afternoons encouraged open windows and fresh air flowing through the rooms. Autumn-covered gardens with leaves requiring endless sweeping. Winter frost-decorated window panes with delicate patterns that fascinated children before the warmth of indoor fires slowly melted them away. Nature constantly reminded families that despite living in one of the world's largest cities, they remained closely connected to the changing seasons. Many London houses also contained small personal collections that reflected the interests of their owners. One gentleman proudly displayed geological specimens gathered during holidays. Another filled shelves with books describing distant countries he hoped someday to visit. Some families collected seashells, pressed flowers, antique coins, or beautifully illustrated botanical drawings. These collections offered glimpses into personalities that formal Victorian manners often concealed. Even ordinary evenings possessed their own comforting rhythm. Tea was poured into delicate china cups. Someone unfolded the newspaper while another reached for a favourite novel. The piano might provide gentle music for half an hour before conversation naturally resumed. Sewing baskets appeared beside comfortable chairs as repairs to stockings, collars, or children's clothing continued almost automatically while stories were exchanged. The room glowed softly beneath lamplight, creating a peaceful atmosphere that invited people to slow down rather than hurry through the hours. For elderly family members, the house became a living archive of memory. Every room reminded them of someone or something from years gone by. A particular chair recalled a beloved spouse who had once sat there every evening. The nursery brought back memories of children now grown into adults with families of their own. The dining room echoed with Christmas dinners stretching back decades. Simply walking from one room to another meant passing through layers of personal history invisible to younger generations. As the 19th century continued, small technological improvements gradually entered these homes. Better gas lighting appeared in some neighbourhoods. Indoor plumbing slowly became more common among wealthier households. Improved cooking ranges made kitchen work slightly easier than it had been for previous generations. Yet, despite these advances, the essential rhythm of domestic life remained remarkably consistent. People still gathered around shared meals, wrote letters by hand, visited neighbours in person, and measured time by clocks rather than electronic devices. Late one evening, after visitors had departed and the family prepared for bed, the lady of the house might take one final walk through the downstairs rooms. She checked that windows were properly secured, lamps safely extinguished, curtains neatly closed, and chairs returned to their places. It was a quiet ritual repeated countless times over the years. Looking around the peaceful rooms, she saw not merely furniture and decorations, but the visible results of years spent building a stable and welcoming home. Meanwhile, outside the front door, London remained endlessly alive. Steam drifted from railway stations. Factory chimneys continued releasing smoke into the night sky. Newspaper presses prepared tomorrow's headlines. Ships unloaded cargo along the Thames, while market workers organised produce before dawn. The city never completely rested, yet behind the sturdy walls of the house, another ordinary day had reached its gentle conclusion. Perhaps that is why these Victorian homes continue to fascinate us more than a century later. Their beauty was never found only in elegant architecture or expensive furnishings. Their greatest richness came from the lives quietly unfolding within them. They sheltered children growing into adults, families celebrating milestones, servants dedicating years of faithful work, friendships lasting decades, and countless ordinary moments that no artist painted and no historian recorded. If those old London houses from the 1850s could somehow open their doors once more, they would not first show us grand dining rooms or polished silver. They would show us the unseen details that truly mattered. The maid quietly lighting the first fire before dawn, the comforting smell of fresh bread rising from the kitchen, the sound of children's laughter drifting from the nursery, the gentle clink of teacups during afternoon conversations, the warmth of a family gathered around a glowing fireplace while rain tapped softly against the windows, and the peaceful silence that settled over every room after another. Well-lived day came to an end. In those simple moments lay the true hidden life of Victorian London. Not a world of constant drama, but one of quiet routine, enduring relationships and everyday lives that, though long forgotten by history, helped shape the character of an entire age. Beyond the polished parlours and carefully arranged dining rooms, there was another hidden layer to Victorian domestic life that rarely appeared in paintings or novels. It was the quiet understanding that a house was never truly finished. There was always another curtain to mend, another loose tile to repair, another chimney to sweep, another cupboard to organise, another account book to balance. A well-kept home was not the result of a single day's effort, but of thousands of small tasks repeated faithfully over many years. The house demanded constant attention, and in return it offered stability, comfort, and a sense of belonging. Every Monday looked remarkably similar to the Monday before it. Every Tuesday carried its own familiar responsibilities. Certain days were traditionally reserved for laundry, others for baking, polishing silver, changing bed linens, or receiving visitors. These weekly rhythms became so deeply rooted that family members rarely questioned them. Even children understood that some mornings the house would smell of fresh bread, while others would be filled with steam from endless washing. The passing of the week could almost be measured by the changing sounds and scents drifting through the rooms. Sown of the least noticed but most important places was the pantry shelf where household account books were kept. These neatly written ledgers recorded every purchase, from sacks of flour to candles, from coal deliveries to fresh vegetables. Nothing was considered too small to record. A careful housekeeper could tell exactly how much tea had been used over the past month, or whether the household had spent more on meat than during the previous winter. These records reflected a Victorian belief that prosperity depended as much upon careful management as upon income itself. Morning deliveries became a familiar performance that unfolded almost every day. The milkman left heavy metal cans by the kitchen entrance. The baker arrived carrying baskets still warm from the oven. The coal merchant unloaded dark, dusty sacks into the cellar. Occasionally the fishmonger appeared with the day's catch packed in damp cloth, while the greengrocer displayed baskets overflowing with carrots, onions, cabbage, apples, and potatoes. Servants checked every delivery carefully before carrying everything inside. The household depended upon these reliable routines as surely as it depended upon sunrise. There was also an invisible hierarchy even within the house itself. The grand front staircase belonged primarily to the family and their guests, while narrow back staircases were used almost exclusively by servants moving quickly between floors. Visitors rarely noticed these hidden passages, yet they allowed domestic staff to perform their duties efficiently without constantly interrupting family life. Entire networks of service corridors, pantry doors, and side entrances quietly kept the household functioning behind the scenes. Afternoons often brought a peaceful stillness after the busyness of the morning had passed. Sunlight stretched slowly across polished wooden floors, clocks ticked steadily in nearly empty rooms, and distant sounds from the street drifted faintly through closed windows. The lady of the house might sit near the window writing letters with careful handwriting, while a daughter practiced scales on the piano in another room. Somewhere upstairs, a maid quietly repaired torn clothing with tiny, almost invisible stitches. None of these activities seemed remarkable, yet together they formed the ordinary rhythm of Victorian domestic life. Books were handled with almost ceremonial respect before opening a favourite volume. Someone might gently brush away a little dust from its leather cover. Pages were turned carefully to avoid tearing delicate paper. When finished, the book was returned precisely to its place upon the shelf, rather than left lying around. A personal library represented years of gradual collecting, and every volume reflected the family's interests, education, and aspirations. As evening approached, the transformation of the house happened almost instinctively. Curtains were closed room by room, lamps were lit before darkness fully arrived, and fireplaces received fresh coal until cheerful flames once again illuminated the sitting rooms. Shadows danced softly across wallpaper, while polished brass reflected the warm glow. Outside, London became colder and darker, but indoors the atmosphere remained welcoming, almost sheltered from the enormous city surrounding it. The sounds of the neighbourhood also changed with the hour. During the day, horse-drawn wagons, vendors calling out their goods, children playing, and church bells created a lively background. After sunset, those sounds gradually faded, replaced by the slower rhythm of occasional carriages returning home, distant footsteps echoing along cobbled streets, and the soft whistle of the night watchman making his rounds. Families often recognized these familiar sounds so well that they unconsciously used them to judge the passing hours. For many people, the final hour before bed was the most peaceful part of the entire day. There were no visitors to entertain, no household instructions to give, and no urgent errands left unfinished. Someone quietly folded the newspaper after reading the final article. Another carefully wound the clocks that would continue ticking until morning. A child hugged a favourite toy before climbing beneath heavy blankets. Parents paused briefly outside bedroom doors to ensure every lamp had been extinguished safely. These simple rituals signalled that another successful day had reached its end. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about life inside London's houses during the 1850s was how ordinary it all seemed to those who lived it. They did not believe they were participating in history. They were simply preparing breakfast, teaching children, writing letters, repairing clothing, balancing accounts, welcoming guests, tending fires, and caring for one another. Yet those ordinary actions, repeated millions of times across thousands of homes, quietly shaped Victorian society far more than many famous speeches or political debates ever could. Generations later, when descendants occasionally returned to visit an old family home, they often found themselves overwhelmed by unexpected memories. The scent of polished oak, the echo of footsteps in the hallway, the familiar view from an upstairs window, or the afternoon sunlight falling across the drawing-room floor could instantly transport them back to childhood. Although furniture had changed and new families now occupied the rooms, Something about the house still seemed to preserve echoes of its former life. Today, many of those Victorian houses continue standing across London. Their brick walls have watched motor cars replace horse-drawn carriages, electric lights replace candles, telephones replace handwritten letters, and modern kitchens replace smoky coal ranges. Yet beneath layers of renovation, many still retain traces of the world that existed in the 1850s. Original fireplaces remain hidden behind newer walls. Worn staircases still bear the marks of countless footsteps. Old servant bells occasionally survive inside forgotten cupboards, silent reminders of an era when entire households moved according to their gentle ringing. If you stood quietly inside one of those surviving houses and allowed yourself to imagine its past, you might almost hear the faint sounds that once filled its rooms, the rustle of long dresses across polished floors, the gentle clink of china during afternoon tea, the distant laughter of children playing upstairs, the steady scratching of a pen across thick paper, the cheerful crackling of coal in the fireplace, and the soft voice of a mother wishing her children good night before closing the bedroom door. Those sounds have long since faded into history, but for nearly every family who lived there, they form the soundtrack of everyday life, and perhaps that is the greatest mystery hidden inside London's houses of the 1850s. Their true importance was never found in expensive furniture, fashionable wallpaper, or elegant architecture. It was found in the quiet repetition of ordinary days, days filled with work, conversation, kindness, patience, hope, and love. These were lives that rarely attracted attention beyond the front door, yet together they created the living heartbeat of Victorian London. Behind every neat brick facade stood a family writing its own story, one peaceful sunrise and one flickering candlelit evening at a time, leaving behind memories that lingered long after the final fire had burned low and the last footsteps had faded from the old wooden floors. Even after everyone had gone to bed, the house seemed to hold on to the warmth and conversations of the day. The dining table still carried the faint scent of polished wood and beeswax. The drawing room remained arranged exactly as the family had left it, with books resting neatly beside comfortable chairs, and a pair of reading spectacles forgotten on a small side table. Upstairs, bedrooms settled into complete silence, interrupted only by the occasional turning of a page from someone reading by candlelight, before sleep finally arrived. These peaceful hours revealed a side of Victorian life that was rarely hurried. Night was a time for quiet reflection, rather than constant activity. The moonlight entering through tall sash windows created soft patterns across wooden floors, while outside the rooftops of London stretched endlessly beneath a sky, often hazy with smoke from thousands of chimneys. Church spires rose above the surrounding houses, their clocks faithfully announcing each passing hour. Somewhere in the distance, the slow whistle of a steam engine reminded listeners that trains continued arriving and departing throughout the night, carrying passengers, letters, and goods to every corner of Britain. Yet inside the house, those distant sounds seemed almost dreamlike, softened by thick brick walls and heavy curtains. Early risers occasionally enjoyed one of the most beautiful sights the house could offer. As dawn slowly approached, sunlight reached the upper windows first, casting a warm golden glow across bedrooms while the streets below still lay in shadow. Dust particles drifted lazily through the light like tiny floating stars before servants quickly removed them during the morning cleaning. The city outside gradually awakened as shopkeepers unlocked their doors. Horses stamped impatiently before beginning another day's work, and the smell of fresh bread spread through nearby streets. One remarkable feature of Victorian homes was how they adapted to different moments of life without changing their appearance. The drawing room that welcomed cheerful visitors one afternoon could become a quiet place of mourning the following week. The nursery that echoed with children's laughter eventually became a bedroom for a growing teenager. A study where business letters were written for decades might later become a peaceful reading room after retirement. The house evolved gently alongside the family, reflecting every stage of life while its walls remained outwardly unchanged. Many households also preserved traditions that had been followed for generations. A particular chair belonged to the eldest member of the family and was rarely used by anyone else. Certain recipes appeared only during holidays, prepared exactly as grandparents had taught many years before. Favorite stories were read aloud every Christmas, and familiar songs were played on the piano until every child knew the melodies by heart. These traditions created a powerful sense of continuity, allowing children to feel connected not only to their parents, but also to ancestors they had never met. The scent of the house changed subtly throughout the day. Morning carried the aroma of fresh tea, toast, and coal fires being lit. Midday brought the smell of soup simmering in the kitchen, polished furniture, and flowers standing in decorative vases. Evening filled the rooms with roasted meat, warm bread, candle wax, and the comforting fragrance of burning coal. Even the clean scent of freshly laundered linens drying near the kitchen range became part of the household's familiar atmosphere. Long after moving away, many people remembered these smells more vividly than the appearance of the rooms themselves. Children often invented imaginary adventures within the familiar surroundings of the home. A staircase became the deck of a great sailing ship crossing dangerous seas. The dining table transformed into a royal castle during games played, while adults were absent. Blankets draped over chairs created secret hideouts where whispered conversations continued for hours. Although Victorian childhood included strict discipline, moments of creativity and laughter quietly flourished whenever opportunities appeared. Older family members frequently spent time near the windows, observing the changing world beyond the glass. They watched fashionable clothing styles gradually evolve, new horse-drawn omnibuses travel unfamiliar routes, and neighbourhoods slowly expand farther into the countryside. Construction workers erected new terraces, churches, schools, and railway lines with astonishing speed. London constantly reinvented itself, yet the view from the drawing room window allowed residents to witness that transformation one ordinary day at a time. Servants, too, formed lasting memories within the same walls. A young maid beginning her first position often arrived nervous and uncertain. Yet years later she might know every creaking floorboard, every family preference, and every hidden cupboard better than anyone else. Experienced servants could predict exactly when guests would arrive, which meals children preferred, and how much coal would be needed before a cold spell arrived. Their knowledge of the household became so complete that they often anticipated problems before anyone else noticed them. The attic remained one of the house's quietest witnesses to passing time. New trunks gradually joined older ones, each containing carefully folded clothing, faded ribbons, forgotten toys, school books, letters, and family keepsakes that no one wished to throw away. Dust settled gently over these possessions, while years slipped past unnoticed. Occasionally someone climbed the narrow staircase searching for a particular item, only to spend an hour rediscovering long-forgotten memories hidden inside weathered wooden boxes. Even after decades of occupation, certain parts of the house remained almost unchanged. The front door continued welcoming visitors just as it always had. The hallway still echoed with familiar footsteps. The fireplace remained the center of family gatherings each winter. The kitchen continued producing meals from dawn until evening. These constants provided reassurance in a world where almost everything outside seemed to be changing faster with every passing year. Perhaps no room reflected the emotional life of the household more than the dining room. Here birthdays were celebrated with candles and laughter. Engagements were announced over carefully prepared dinners. Children nervously shared examination results. Parents offered advice, comfort, or congratulations depending upon the occasion. Guests toasted weddings, welcomed newborn babies, and remembered absent friends around that single table, unfolded countless conversations that shaped the future of everyone seated there. Years later, after the family had grown older and children had established homes of their own, visits back to the old house carried a special feeling. The ceilings seemed lower than remembered, the hallways narrower, and the garden smaller than childhood memories suggested. Yet certain details remained exactly the same. The familiar smell near the front entrance after rain, the pattern of sunlight crossing the staircase each afternoon, and the comforting sound of the grandfather clock continuing to mark the hours, just as it had decades before. In the end, the greatest secret hidden inside London's houses during the 1850s was wonderfully simple. Behind every respectable farfastad existed lives that were neither constantly glamorous nor endlessly dramatic. They were lives built from thousands of ordinary moments. A father reading the evening newspaper beside the fire, a mother carefully sewing a loose button before bedtime, children laughing over a simple game in the nursery, servants sharing a brief smile after finishing another demanding day, grandparents telling stories that would be remembered long after they were gone, and families gathering together beneath the same roof through every season of life. Those moments were so ordinary that nobody imagined they would one day become history. Yet they became the true story of Victorian London. Long after the fashionable clothing disappeared, the horse-drawn carriages vanished, and the coal fires burned for the last time, it was these quiet moments of everyday life that remained the most meaningful, hidden behind polished doors and lace curtains. Beyond the view of hurried pedestrians passing outside, thousands of London homes quietly witnessed the hopes, struggles, triumphs, disappointments, and simple happiness of ordinary families. And in those ordinary lives lived one peaceful day after another. The real heart of the Victorian age continued beating in silence. If you remained inside one of these houses for an entire year, you would begin to notice that every month brought its own familiar rhythm. January was a time of quiet recovery after Christmas celebrations, when decorations were carefully packed away in attic trunks and ordinary routines gently returned. February often brought bitter winds sweeping through London's streets, encouraging families to spend longer evenings gathered close to the fire. By March, the first hints of spring appeared in small gardens behind the houses, where tiny green shoots pushed through dark soil after months of cold weather. The family watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, finding comfort in the certainty that the seasons always returned. Spring cleaning became one of the largest undertakings of the year. Carpets were rolled up and carried outside to be beaten free of dust. Curtains were removed, washed, and hung to dry in the fresh air. Windows received thorough attention until every pane sparkled in the sunlight. Cupboards that had remained untouched through the winter were emptied completely before every shelf was wiped clean. Mattresses were aired, chimneys inspected, and furniture moved, so that forgotten corners could finally be swept. For several days, the normally orderly house became a hive of activity before gradually returning to perfect condition. The small garden behind many London homes became especially important during warmer months. Although often modest in size, it provided a peaceful retreat from the crowded streets beyond the walls. Roses climbed wooden trellises. Herbs filled neat little beds near the kitchen door, and climbing ivy softened the appearance of brick walls blackened by city smoke. Bees drifted lazily among the flowers while sparrows splashed happily in shallow bird baths. On pleasant afternoons, family members carried books or embroidery outside, enjoying precious moments of fresh air without leaving home. The rooftops visible from upstairs windows formed a remarkable landscape of their own. Endless rows of chimney pots stretched toward the horizon like silent sentries guarding the city. Throughout the day, thin streams of smoke curled upward into the sky before merging with London's familiar haze. During sunset, these rooftops glowed with warm shades of orange and gold, creating a surprisingly beautiful scene despite the industrial character of the city. Children often sat beside bedroom windows watching flocks of pigeons circle above the chimneys before settling for the night. Every so often, excitement entered the household through unexpected visitors arriving without much notice. A cousin travelling through London, an old school friend passing nearby, or distant relatives from the countryside might suddenly appear at the front door carrying luggage and cheerful greetings. Spare bedrooms were quickly prepared, extra places set at the dinner table, and the house immediately filled with new conversations. These visits broke the familiar routine in the most welcome way, creating stories that would be remembered long after the guests had returned home. The kitchen pantry reflected the changing seasons just as clearly as the garden. Shelves filled with jars of homemade jams during summer gradually emptied through autumn and winter. Apples stored carefully in cool conditions lasted surprisingly long, while onions, potatoes, and carrots remained dependable staples throughout much of the year. Every shelf demonstrated thoughtful planning, because families understood that careful preparation during one season made the next far more comfortable. Children often measured time differently from adults. Rather than thinking in months or years, they remembered life through important household events. The Christmas when snow covered the garden, the birthday when they received their first storybook, the summer afternoon spent climbing the old apple tree. The evening grandfather told his favourite adventure stories beside the fireplace. To them, the house was not simply a building, but a collection of treasured memories connected to every room. As evening shadows lengthened, gas lamps began glowing along London's streets, casting soft pools of light onto wet cobblestones after rain. Through the front windows, family members could occasionally glimpse neighbours returning home, carrying parcels or umbrellas, while horse-drawn cabs rolled steadily past. The city outside remained full of movement, but indoors another peaceful evening quietly unfolded around familiar routines. conversation often wandered toward hopes for the future. Parents discussed children's education and possible careers. Young people dreamed about travel, marriage, or opportunities waiting beyond London. Newspapers reported astonishing scientific discoveries and engineering achievements that suggested the future might be even more remarkable than the present. Although rooted in tradition, Victorian families were living through one of history's most rapidly changing periods, and many sensed that the world their children inherited would differ greatly from the one they themselves had known. The house also became a place where practical knowledge passed naturally between generations. Grandmothers taught recipes that had never been written down. Fathers showed sons how to maintain pocket watches or polish leather boots properly. Mothers explained the careful management of household accounts. Older sisters demonstrated embroidery techniques to younger siblings. Much of this knowledge was transferred through daily example rather than formal instruction, becoming part of the family's identity over time. Even the weather left lasting impressions upon the building itself. Rain-polished stone steps smooth after countless storms. Sunlight gently faded curtains hanging in the same windows year after year. Frost occasionally cracked old paving stones in the garden, while summer heat caused timber doors to swell slightly within their frames. The house quietly bore the marks of nature just as surely as it carried the marks of the people living inside. As decades passed, many household objects outlived the people who first purchased them. The dining table remained while generations gathered around it. The grandfather clock continued measuring time long after those who had originally wound it each evening were gone. The fireplace warmed grandchildren who never met the grandparents who had once sat before the very same flames. In this way, the house became a silent bridge connecting one generation to the next. Perhaps the most comforting aspect of life inside these London houses was the sense that no matter what troubles existed beyond the front door, the home remained a place of familiarity. Business failures, political debates, changing fashions, and the constant expansion of the city all belonged to the outside world. Crossing the threshold meant returning to familiar voices, familiar rooms, familiar routines, and familiar faces waiting by the fire. The house became more than shelter. It became a refuge from the uncertainty of an increasingly modern age. Looking back today, we often admire Victorian London for its grand railway stations, magnificent museums, and impressive public buildings. Yet those famous landmarks represented only one side of the city. The true soul of London lived quietly inside thousands upon thousands of ordinary houses where families woke before sunrise, shared simple breakfasts, worked diligently throughout the day, gathered together every evening, and drifted peacefully to sleep beneath sturdy roofs that had protected generations before them. Hidden behind each polished brass door knocker was a story that history rarely recorded. It was the story of ordinary people finding happiness in familiar routines, comfort in shared traditions, and hope in tomorrow's sunrise. Their lives were not shaped by spectacular events every day, but by thousands of gentle moments, pouring tea into delicate china cups, reading aloud beside a glowing fireplace, watching rain slide down the windows, hearing children laugh somewhere upstairs, and ending another ordinary evening with the quiet satisfaction that everyone they loved was safe beneath the same roof. Those simple moments, repeated year after year across Victorian London, formed the invisible foundation upon which an entire era quietly stood. There were mornings when a gentle fog settled so thickly over London that the world beyond the front gate almost disappeared. Looking from an upstairs window, the neighbouring houses became little more than faint outlines, their chimneys rising like shadows through the grey mist. The familiar street sounds changed as well. Horse hooves became muffled against damp cobblestones. Carriage wheels seemed farther away than they really were, and voices echoed strangely through the fog before fading into silence. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere felt wonderfully secure. The warmth of the kitchen range, the comforting smell of fresh tea, and the cheerful glow of the fireplace created a sharp contrast with the cold, mysterious city waiting outside. The front parlour was perhaps the room that changed its personality most often. During the morning it remained almost untouched, neat and perfectly arranged in case an unexpected visitor called. By afternoon it became a place for conversation, reading, or music. In the evening, firelight transformed the room into a cosy gathering place, where shadows danced across the wallpaper, and every polished surface reflected a soft golden glow. The same room served many purposes without ever losing its quiet dignity. Visitors often admired the elegant mantelpieces above the fireplaces, decorated with carefully chosen ornaments collected over many years. Small porcelain figures, brass candlesticks, delicate clocks, framed miniature portraits, and fresh flowers arranged in simple vases all reflected the family's taste. None of these objects were especially extravagant by themselves, but together they created an atmosphere of comfort rather than luxury. Victorians believed a home should feel welcoming, not merely impressive. The house also had its own familiar smells, depending upon where you stood. Near the entrance, there was the faint scent of polished oak and recently cleaned brass. The library carried the rich aroma of old leather bindings and paper that had aged gracefully over decades. Upstairs bedrooms smelled of lavender tucked carefully between folded linens. The kitchen offered an ever-changing mixture of baking bread, simmering soup, herbs, and coal smoke. These scents quietly blended together until they became inseparable from memories of home itself. Rainy afternoons often encouraged the family to gather together more closely than usual. Windows blurred beneath steady streams of water, while the sound of rain tapping against the glass became almost hypnotic. Someone settled into a comfortable chair with a novel. Another continued mending clothes. Children worked on school lessons, and the steady ticking of the hallway clock filled the quiet pauses in conversation. Nobody seemed eager to hurry anywhere. The weather itself encouraged patience. Sometimes a family member would climb to the very top of the house simply to enjoy the view across London. From attic windows, the city stretched in every direction as an endless sea of brick rooftops, interrupted only by church towers, factory chimneys, and the occasional dome of an important public building. Smoke drifted lazily upward from thousands of fireplaces, reminding everyone that behind each rooftop another family was beginning its own ordinary day. Looking across that vast landscape, it became easy to imagine countless similar households quietly following routines almost identical to your own. The house itself responded differently to every season. During windy autumn evenings, doors occasionally rattled gently in their frames while fallen leaves collected outside the entrance. Winter covered the windows with delicate frost patterns that fascinated children before breakfast. Spring filled the garden with birdsong drifting through open windows, and summer encouraged the family to leave doors open longer, allowing fresh air to circulate through rooms that had remained tightly closed during colder months. The building seemed almost alive, adapting naturally to the changing year. Every family also developed little traditions known only to themselves. Perhaps everyone gathered in the drawing room every Sunday evening to read aloud together. Maybe birthdays always began with breakfasts served on a special tray. Certain chairs became unofficially reserved for particular people without anyone ever discussing it. A favourite teapot appeared only when close friends visited. These tiny customs rarely seemed important at the time, yet they became treasured memories carried into future generations. The sounds of work inside the house gradually blended into a kind of quiet music. The rhythmic brushing of carpets, the gentle scraping of a chair being pulled toward the fireplace, the soft turning of book pages, the clinking of china during afternoon tea, the distant piano practicing scales upstairs, and the steady chopping of vegetables in the kitchen all created a peaceful soundtrack that defined everyday Victorian domestic life. There was almost always activity somewhere, but rarely unnecessary noise. As children grew older, the house slowly witnessed their transformation into adults. The nursery that once overflowed with toys gradually filled with books and writing desks. Small boots lined beside the front door were replaced by polished shoes suitable for business or social visits. Family photographs expanded year after year as children became young men and women standing proudly beside their parents. The house quietly observed every milestone without ever drawing attention to itself. Occasionally, old family friends visited after many years away. They paused in the hallway, smiling as familiar memories returned. The staircase looked exactly as they remembered. The grandfather clock still stood faithfully in its corner. Even the dining room seemed almost unchanged except for a few new portraits hanging upon the walls. Such visits reminded everyone how deeply a house could become connected with the people who had lived within it. Not every day brought excitement, and perhaps that was exactly the point. Most days passed peacefully, filled with ordinary responsibilities completed one after another. Breakfast, letters, lessons, shopping, cleaning, afternoon tea, dinner, reading, conversation, bedtime. Tomorrow would likely follow much the same pattern, and few people considered that disappointing. In fact, many Victorians believed that a calm, orderly life reflected stability, good character, and contentment. As the years slipped quietly by, London continued expanding beyond imagination. New railway stations welcomed travellers from every direction. Telegraph wires connected distant towns almost instantly. Gas lamps illuminated more streets each year. Great exhibitions celebrated remarkable inventions, changing the modern world. Yet inside these brick houses, families continued finding happiness in remarkably simple pleasures. A well-cooked meal, a thoughtful letter arriving from a loved one, an evening of music around the piano, a warm fire on a cold night, or the reassuring presence of family gathered together beneath one roof. When we imagine Victorian London today, it is tempting to picture only bustling streets, towering factories, and grand public buildings. But the city's real heartbeat could not be found in Parliament, railway stations, or famous landmarks alone. It lived inside these quiet houses, where ordinary mornings began with the smell of coal fires and fresh bread, where afternoons unfolded through conversation and careful routine, where evenings ended with books beside glowing fireplaces, and where generations built lives one ordinary day at a time. Behind every lace curtain was a story. Behind every polished front door was another family waking, working, laughing, worrying, celebrating, growing older, and creating memories that would never appear in history books. Those stories rarely changed the course of nations, yet together they shaped the character of Victorian England itself. They remind us that history is not only made by queens, politicians, inventors, or generals. It is also made quietly inside ordinary homes, where everyday people live lives filled with hope, responsibility, kindness, and resilience. And nowhere was that quiet history more beautifully preserved than inside the hidden world of London's houses during the 1850s, where behind every brick wall and every glowing window, another chapter of ordinary life unfolded in peaceful silence.